Hey, welcome back to week 2. This is a fun week. This is where we begin to dive into the theoretical concepts of organizations and of leadership and begin to understand, wow, who are the pioneers that helped us understand these complex social constructs? So our objectives in week 2 are to look at the evolution of organization theory, the evolution of leadership theory, and some of the competencies then that we're finding emerge throughout decades and decades of studies of organizations and of leaders and leadership. So why this focus on organizational theory and leadership theory? Well, let's remember where we came from. You know, in the early 1800s, less than 20% of the people in this country depended on organizations for an income. Most people were farmers or self-employed. They weren't working in organizations. Well, what happened? Because by 1950, 90% of the people in this country, by 1950, now depend on organizations for an income. Well, what happened was the Industrial Revolution. You know, I had the automobile industry, the oil industry, the railroads. There was this technological explosion, and suddenly huge factories were produced, cities emerged, and the shift came where people were now suddenly working in organizations and large organizations. Well, that required then a whole new level of research and understanding to know, well, how do organizations work? Why are some working better than others? What's the best way to advance an organization? What are quality organizations? What kind of leaders emerge? What are good leaders? How are competencies defined that determine which leaders are going to be successful? Well, it's a great field of science. And we're going to do just a quick run through. And I'm going to highlight just a few of my favorites. I'd encourage you this week, just Google up things about organizational theory, leadership theory. You're going to pull up hundreds of things, and you're going to see some that catch your eye and are of interest. There's many, 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 many. I'm cherry picking a few that, for me, I think relate to this world of healthcare quality and safety. And I'm going to tell you, why as I introduce them. Well, the person you see here is Max Weber. It says Weber, but if you're a real student of organizational theory, he goes by Max Weber. And Max was a German guy, and he grew up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where we're seeing this Prussia start to move into more of a modernized Germany. And what was the contribution that Max made? Max is the person, when you hear bureaucracy, that developed the concept of the bureau. Now, typically we think of bureaucracy as bad. Oh my God, it's stifling. The term bureaucracy often has negative connotations. But let's really get at the origins of what did Max do? Max said, wait a minute, how had authority been passed down before some of the Industrial Revolution and some of the development of and the rise of organizations? Well, authority was passed down largely by inheritance, or you married into it. You know, if I'm the emperor, the king, or the czar, or the queen, or whatever it might be, there was a line of succession. Max said, hey, this isn't right. We should be doing this based on competencies. Who's qualified for the job? Now, we take that for granted now, but at that point in time where you gained leadership over organizations or over vast parts of government by marrying into a family or by inheritance passed to you through direct descendancy, this was a radical concept. And Max was able to advance the idea that no, in today's world, we have to look at who's competent to perform the job. They have to be trained, they have to be certified, and we have the bureau that reviews and credentials people, and they have to be able to be competent to hold those jobs. Now, why is that important in healthcare? Well, we certainly know now that the kinds of certifications, whether it's in quality and safety or other components, healthcare is a very specialized endeavor, and it really depends on the competencies of individuals to ensure the quality and safety to our patients. So this idea came out of its origins from Max Weber in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And while some people lament the creation of the bureaucracy, we have to remember that it really helped move off the point of inheritance of authority and move to competency-based roles. Well, another person that came along in that era was Frederick Taylor, F.W. Taylor. Now, what did he do that makes me want to pull him out and highlight him? Well, Taylor was a person that said, gee, there's science to our work, even the most mundane work. He actually studied workers who were shoveling ore for an organization. And he noted that they were all using the same shovel regardless of what type of job they were doing. And he said, this isn't right. Now this person should use this kind of shovel. And he began to measure and watch individual workers and designed different shovels that, while this seems like a silly endeavor, hugely increased the worker productivity within the organization. Frederick Taylor went on then to become kind of the king of what we call time and motion studies. He was what we might call one of the first industrial engineers that said, there's science to our work, we have to study all the components. Now think of this in terms of your healthcare quality and safety, how we look at processes, we do process flow maps, we work to understand what is each individual person's role and how do we optimize that. The foundations of that were really well laid. If you look at Deming and some of the other quality leaders that followed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they built a lot on Taylor's work. So Taylor was the first one that says, we can't just tell people to go do a job. It's leadership's responsibility to understand it, to optimize it, and to know the factors that drive it. Now, the downside of Taylor, however, was the fact that he didn't have much regard for the workers themselves. He felt workers by nature will do the least possible to get by. And he was a little bit jaded in terms of the workforce. And so his entire focus on managers and their leadership was on driving systems engineering and just pressing workers to perform it to the maximum. Well, thank goodness there were other people of this same era that began to look at worker productivity from a different standpoint. And instead of looking at, gee, did they have the right shovels? Was the lighting right? Was the tool perfect? Was the assembly line process correct? They said, well, what about the worker themselves? How do they feel about their work? Now, a gentleman named Elton Mayo actually began what was called the human relations movement. And probably you've heard of one of the most often cited pieces of his work was the Hawthorne Electric Company. Hawthorne Electric Company was looking at the production of their workers, and they said, gee, I think if we increase the lighting, we might get better productivity. So Elton Mayo conducted those experiments and found as we turned the lighting up, yeah, that productivity went up. Well, let's turn it up a little bit more. So Mayo turned up the productivity again and found, gee, on the studies, the workers' productivity went up. So he found progressively increasing the lighting seemed to increase worker productivity. So he said, well, we have to control for this, so let's drop the lighting. Well, they dropped the lighting, and what do you think happened? Productivity went up again, yet again. Now, how is this possible? If you're Frederick Taylor, you're saying, wait a minute, no, this is driven by the lighting. What Elton Mayo discovered was, no. The workers understand that you're looking at their work, what they're doing is important. And you're trying to see how to optimize it. And that the commitment of the workers was what really was driving these continued advances in worker productivity, not the lighting. Well, out of that became many, many, many schools of leadership that focused then on how we value these employees. A gentleman by the name of Peter Blau developed this whole idea of social exchange theory. I do good things for you, not because it's immediately paid in a fee or some monetary reward, but knowing that you'll take care of me. And we have this understanding of social exchange, that there's unguaranteed, unpromised rewards that come from working hard, that it'll be acknowledged, that people will be appreciated for their work, and that employers will find some way to enhance the lives of people who work hard, even though it might not be in a contract or in a specific compensation table. So that field of social exchange led to the whole world of organizational justice and things that drive today's environment of how organizations operate in terms of fairness, justice, and the recognition of the importance of the contribution of every individual worker within the organization. Well, as leaders began to develop their leadership, one of the things that also became important from a worker's perspective was how they use the power. Leaders who had a well-cultivated sense of self-awareness recognized that, yeah, you could use power of authority. You know, I'm the boss. I can fire you. I have the right to withhold your wages or raise your wages. Those coercive types of power, which French and Raven called positional power, could be effective over a short period of time. But what they really found was that the power bases that were important were the personal power bases. Those things that said, you're going to do something for me not because I have threat of coercion, but I create a motivating environment for you to want to do this electively because we are partners in this endeavor. And so he talks about the personal power bases of referent power, you know, a leader that is well liked by their employees. Expert power, you've got expertise that's respected. You've got connection power. You know, you've got the ability to pull other people in to the endeavor, and that employees long-term will respond better to those types of power. So French and Raven are the first ones to really start to break down, yes, there's power in leadership, but in different organizations, there's a profound difference on the response of the employees to which type of power you use. And I can tell you this from my experience at Mayo Clinic, that use of position power would be a very, very career-limiting type of exercise in that culture of egalitarianism. Okay, so let's get on to a couple other leaders who are more contemporary, DiMaggio and Powell, and they talked about a concept called institutional isomorphism. Now again, we're studying how do institutions and organizations work, and why is it important for you to know this? Well, one, it's part of the fun of knowing what's the evolution, how did we get to where we are in terms of our understanding of organizational competency and leadership. Well, DiMaggio and Powell began to notice, you know, at some point organizations start to look more like each other than they should need to. And he called this institutional isomorphism. And what they meant by that was, why do organizations look like each other when there's no business reason driving this, no practical reason, no advantage? And what they found is certain industries, and healthcare is very prone to this, where it's highly regulated, externally evaluated, constantly benchmarked, that innovation starts to give way to adherence to standards. And that one of the risks as we look at quality and safety and advancing those things is just looking to replicate what others have done. We go to a national meeting, this is the one way to do it. And do we allow that to stifle our innovation or to be led by external factors? And I'll give you an example at Mayo Clinic. we had a team approach to anesthesia. And our nurse anesthetist and anesthesiologist worked in a collaborative, team-oriented fashion that helped them deliver some of the highest quality anesthesia outcomes in the world. But if you would go to an anesthesia meeting, the anesthesiologist had a separate meeting from the nurse anesthetists, and the anesthesiologists at their meetings would say, gee, you know, we got to be careful about nurse anesthetists and what their role is becoming. And the nurse anesthetist meeting, annual meeting would say, gee, the anesthesiologists, we got to watch them because they're sort of trying to control and limit our scope of practice. And they became a little bit almost adversarial, yet within our organization, our approach had to be not aligned necessarily with what are these professional organizations trying to advance to, but what is it that's best for our patients and the outcomes. So DiMaggio and Powell offer us a good reminder in healthcare that while we have to learn from each other, we still have to be bold enough to be innovative and to not be entrapped by things that we do to look like someone else for no apparent reason to us. You know, we all want to be accredited. And I know accreditation, it's easier if you look like what they're looking for. But sometimes you have to take the risk and say, well, we do it a different way. Let's look at our outcomes, and let's look at how we're performing relative to our patients and the standards. And I think that's becoming more and more acceptable because of the work that has its historic roots in the work of DiMaggio and Powell. Okay, so we've talked about organization theory. Then there's the development of leadership theory. So this is how organizations have evolved. So we ran through a quick litany of people that helped us understand organizations. We did a quick walkthrough of several. There's many more I encourage you to read. It's fascinating, fun reading. It gives you so many insights into how is it that organizations have come to structure themselves and perform the way they do. And there's a lot of research and science into it, and it's a fun read. But what about the focus then on leaders and leadership itself? Well, that too is a diverse and complex evolution of thought and theory. Your textbooks this week really offer a good history in it, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Here's from one of your textbooks a real good primer, and I really encourage you to carefully read and look at the tables in the books regarding this history of the evolution of leadership theory. I'm going to pick just a few again that personally I think are important to understand. And the first is the idea that there's traits. Great leaders are born and not made. And this was the early origins of trait theory that said, so therefore, if we just study great leaders, we can learn what it is that makes a great leader. And then we'll just replicate. We'll look for people that have those traits, and because leaders are born and not made. But it was interesting, because after years and years and years of study, one prominent researcher in the field of leadership research noted that 50 years of study have failed to produce one personality trait or set of qualities that can be used to discriminate leaders from non-leaders. And what they said was, you know, great leaders come in all variety of shapes and sizes, and with all kinds of different attributes. So this idea of just focusing on a small set of traits and then trying to just identify people have those really isn't going to yield the results that we thought. Well, then we moved into, well, there must be styles then. It's got to be style, democratic versus autocratic. And it was interesting in that post-World War II, there were some studies, I think it was in boys' summer camps, that looked at productivity based on did we give them democratic leadership or autocratic leadership. And what they found was, gee, the democratic ones seemed to do better in terms of how they were performing in these camps. And so that was a great result. Now, why was that a great result? Well, remember we had just come over the end of World War II. And it was the triumph of democracy over dictatorship. So we very much wanted to believe that leadership style, absolutely democratic leaders were more effective and their teams produced more than highly directive leaders. But, you know, that actually didn't turn out to be absolute recipe for success either. So the idea of leadership style couldn't describe all the differences in why some leaders are successful and why some aren't. So fast forward, I will tell you, in the mid-70s, some of the authors that I thought were interesting, Hersey and Blanchard said, wow, you know, really great leaders need to have a range of styles. And you need to know when to deploy them. The real critical thing is knowing what situation to use what style. I was a ICU nurse manager at the time, and it really resonated with me. Because I said, yeah, I know, that's really true. A new nurse coming into the ICU, just into orientation, and they come up there and patients are on ventilators and all these tubes and pumps and drips and physicians all around asking this and that. The last thing they want is for me as a nurse manager to say, well, you know, I want to be democratic. You go in there and just have at it and do what you want to do. No, my gosh, those people said, tell me what to do, exactly what to do. I don't want to kill anybody. I don't want to cause any harm. I absolutely can't be left alone. Tell me exactly what to do. So it called for a highly directive style of leadership there. Now fast forward a year, that same nurse, if I went in there and they were working with a patient and I said, gee, you know, you should be doing this, this, and this, that same nurse would look at me and say, hey, don't you have more important things to do or someplace else you need to be? Because they had advanced to the point where the leadership style required was much more of a collaborative delegating style. And this is what Hersey and Blanchard talked about, and they've written several books on organizational behavior and leadership. And they talk about this as situational leadership and knowing the maturity of individuals and groups. Because as leaders, sometimes you manage groups, and you can have people that are mature people, but you put them in a new group, you have to assume that the group's not mature. And they really talked about the importance of understanding and knowing what type of leadership style is required in any given situation. So they were sort of a seminal thought leaders in understanding why isn't there one best style of leadership? Well, I'm going to let you, for your own interests, read and look into, if you'd like to read more about Hersey and Blanchard and their grid. You're going to find in your book leader types and different ways that they put in quadrants leaders. Again, my concern about those is sometimes they try to pigeonhole leader that, okay, you're this kind of leader, when really Hersey and Blanchard would say, well, sometimes you need to be that kind of leader, but sometimes you need to be this kind of leader. And people are not limited to one style. If you believe, as I do, that leadership is learned, that you're constantly learning your leadership skills, as we're hoping to do throughout this 8-week course, that you learn more about yourself as a leader and understand that it is a non-ending learning process. So you'll never finish learning about how to be more effective as a leader. There's many management theories that emerge, and I think your textbooks outline those well. I won't go through them all here, but I do think you need to know that within this domain of leadership theory and understanding, it all gets at helping you be effective at mastering certain competencies. For your team to be successful, for your organization to be successful, for you to be successful, there's certain sets of skills that as a leader you want to have mastery over. The ability to manage change, communicate a vision, the ability to understand and drive your culture and your climate within the organization. These are all things that are part of those leadership skills that you're going to start to develop. I'm guessing you already have by now. You're in a graduate level program. You've been a leader. You've been exercising leadership skills, and you're going to continue to evolve and advance those. That's all for week 2. Hope this has helped set the stage. You've got some good readings this week, and I hope you find them interesting. and we'll look forward to your participation on the discussion boards.